I'll forgive you just this once, so just come back. In return, from now on, remember your place and never challenge me again." I told the truth to Andy, who was spewing all sorts of nonsense, without knowing anything, in a straightforward manner. I'm Haley, 34 years old. We just got married just 6 months ago, and I work part-time. After graduating from university, I got a job as an accountant. I met my husband, Andy, who is 3 years older than me, 2 years ago through a mutual friend. He's not talkative or flashy, but he has a kind and serious personality. Both of us were at an age where marriage was on our minds from the beginning, so our relationship started with that in mind. Neither Andy nor I are the passionate type in love, and we valued each other's alone time. Our relationship continued smoothly, and the introduction to each other's parents went smoothly with no particular problems as well. My in-laws are sensible people, and they were happy about our relationship, and I somehow felt at home when I was with Andy. I thought I could live a peaceful life with him, and accepted his proposal. Even after we got married, I continued working. Though we both worked, I handled most of the housework. When I was busy at work and I had to work a lot of overtime, it was overwhelming to do both work and housework, but Andy never volunteered to help with household chores, or showed appreciation for my efforts. He has a somewhat old-fashioned belief that housework is a woman's duty, and stubbornly refuses to help. On weekends, he often goes out alone in the morning, and comes back drunk in the evening. However, my parents also both worked, and my mother, who was a nurse, did most of the housework. My father was a workaholic, and even made my mother take care of him. I grew up in that kind of home, so I was not bothered by it, and accepted it without much thought. We didn't have a passionate and great love, but we respected each other's values. Even though we were a married couple, we cherished each other's alone time. We share the same kind of thoughts like that, so we've been living peacefully, without any major arguments. One day, around midnight, Andy came home, reeking of alcohol, and he was in a bad mood. I called out to him as he took off his shoes at the front door, but he ignored me and headed for the living room. I sighed at his behavior. It's happening again. I had learned since we got married that, when something bothered Andy, he would ignore me like this. I didn't know with whom he had been drinking, but something unpleasant must have happened to him while he was drinking. At times like these, it was best to leave him alone. I knew that saying anything would be futile, and by the next morning, he'd be back to normal, acting as if nothing had happened. In the living room, Andy muttered something in a sullen tone, but I fell asleep without paying much attention. The next morning, as I was preparing breakfast in the kitchen, Andy, who was half asleep, came in. "Good morning. Breakfast will be ready soon, so please wait a bit," I said to him, but Andy glanced at me briefly, picked up the lunchbox I had left on the table, and without a word, he left. It seemed his mood hadn't improved yet. Andy had ignored me before, but usually, it only lasted a night. I took it lightly, thinking it was just a rare occurrence, and resumed preparing breakfast without dwelling on it too much. However, that night and the following day, Andy remained sullen and continued to ignore me. Until now, I've been ignored many times before, but never for this long. Even though I hadn't taken it too seriously until now, I was starting to feel anxious. I wondered what to do, but even when I tried to initiate conversation, he didn't respond at all, and when I texted me, the messages were left unread. Yet, when I prepared a meal for him, he would finish it, and he seemed to be eating the lunch I made for him as well, so I decided to put a letter in his lunch bag. In the letter, I expressed my gratitude to Andy. I told him how sad it made me when he ignored me, and that I wanted things to go back to the way they used to be. I wrote it with all my heart, but tried not to make it too heavy at the same time. I was sure this would make him change his attitude. However, my faint hope would soon be shattered. That night when Andy returned home, he said something unbelievable. As he entered the living room and saw me setting up dinner, he looked at me and said this: I'm busy unlike you. Starting today, there's a fine of $100 if you talk to me. I don't want to waste my precious time on useless conversations with you. Now, pay me $100 for talking to me this morning. As I stood there dumbfounded, Andy held out his right hand, as if to say, hurry up. He let out a sigh without a word and looked at me. Wait a minute. That's ridiculous. I protested, and he said, an additional $100, so total is $200. As he kept holding out his right hand, he muttered while showing clear disgust. Andy took out $200 from my wallet, which was left on the table, while ignoring me who was stunned, and threw the wallet roughly onto the floor. Then, without a word of gratitude, he started eating dinner, and without saying thanks, he left the table. His silence continued even after that, and before I knew it, 3 weeks had passed. I have thought and tried everything I can to change the situation, but nothing I have done has had any effect at all. Then one night, I was running out of ideas, so I resorted to a drastic strategy, thinking it was the only way to get what I wanted. It was the method of intentionally not making dinner. I had always prepared dinner and made sure that it was ready around the time Andy came home. If I stopped making the dinner for him suddenly, even he might be willing to talk to me. I thought that way. When Andy returned home in a bad mood, I deliberately paid him no attention and watched TV in the living room. Andy, who has just got home, stared at the empty dining table for a moment before directing his gaze at me. I felt his gaze on me, but intentionally refrained from taking any action and waited silently for him to initiate a conversation. Then, Andy let out a sigh with a displeased look and left the room without a word. From the front door, I heard him open and close the door violently. I was taken aback, and I remained frozen in place for a while. Why does Andy continue to ignore me like this? I had no clue, and at that moment, I just hung my head in dismay. The next morning, I woke up at sunrise to make his lunch as usual and headed for the living room, but there was no sign of Andy in the house. Had he gone to work this early in the morning? Puzzled, I put on an apron, and as I did, I noticed a note on the dining table. Upon reading what was written on the note, I was so shocked that I lost my words, and I stood there motionless. The note simply said, "Don't neglect housework," in messy handwriting. The moment I read it, I felt like something inside me snapped. I couldn't endure this any longer. Did I have to live my life, always trying to please Andy? No, I couldn't bear it. Though we were never overly affectionate, even when we were dating, this kind of marital relationship was abnormal. If I had done something to upset him, I might understand, but being ignored without any reason was wearing me down, and I had reached my limit. In a corner of the note Andy had left, I added a single line, "I'm going back to my parents." Swiftly, I packed my belongings and left the house. I didn't return home after work, and I went to my parents' house instead. My parents were surprised when I suddenly visited them, but as I explained the strange situation of ours, such as the fact that Andy had been ignoring me for the past 3 weeks, and demanded a $100 fine for talking to him, and I had no idea why he is doing this to me, they sympathized with me and kindly accepted me. Having found a refuge, I felt genuinely relieved, and for the time being, I planned to stay at my parents' house, keeping an eye on what Andy would do next, before deciding how to proceed. That night, as expected, Andy didn't contact me. I'm sure he was simply dismissing my actions and continuing to ignore me. This might turn into a long battle. In the following days, there was still no contact from Andy, no calls or texts, and he didn't come to my parents' house either. With no word from him, for half a year had passed, and I had almost forgotten about Andy. Then one Sunday, I opened the front door to go out, and Andy was waiting for me with a furious look on his face and his arms crossed. He stared at me without saying a word, as I was so surprised that I let out a short scream, and I stood there. Though I was dismayed by him, who still continued ignoring me, The next moment, Andy abruptly pushed me aside, attempting to enter my parents' house. "Wait a minute!" I hurriedly stopped him. Andy stared at me in what seemed like disbelief, with his eyes widening, but he remained silent. With a firm tone, I told him, "Please don't enter without permission. I'll call the authorities." Finally, Andy spoke, after 6 months of silence. His words were a barrage of harsh insults. "Huh? Who do you think you're talking to with such a cheeky attitude? Do you think you're good enough to talk back to me? Just because you're at your parents' place, don't get cocky." I wondered if Andy had always been this rude. While I was lost in my thoughts, he yelled, erupting with anger. "Hey, are you listening? Stop messing around. You've been gone for half a year, leaving our house in shambles. Who the hell do you think you are?" As I stood there in shock, he suddenly changed his expression, adopting a calm demeanor, and he continued condescendingly, "That being said, I'm a generous guy, so I'll forgive you this time. But from now on, know your place, and don't ever cross me again." Andy looked down on me with arrogance. I said calmly, with a pitying look on my face, "What are you talking about? Forgive you, don't cross me? You and I are no longer married, right?" Andy seemed taken aback by my words, but he quickly twisted his face into a grotesque expression and started yelling loudly again. "What the heck do you mean by we're no longer married? There's no way that's true. We're a legitimate married couple, aren't we? If you keep messing around, I'll seriously get angry. I said I'd forgive you this time, so just come back home." I had reached my limit with his selfish arguments. He is the one who ignored me for over 6 months, said that talking with me was a waste of time, and even made me pay a fine in the first place. It was infuriating that he said it, as if all of this was somehow my fault. About half a year ago, there had been a significant change in my life, but it seemed Andy was completely unaware. I told the truth to Andy, who was spewing all sorts of nonsense, without knowing anything, in a straightforward manner. "As soon as I left the house and started living with my parents, your mother handed me the divorce papers, which were already signed, so I filled in my section and signed, and submitted it to the city hall on the same day. You and I are already divorced." Andy's face turned pale, and he looked utterly shocked. Several days after returning to my parents' home, my ex-mother-in-law called me, and I headed to the cafe where she asked me to meet her after work. My ex-mother-in-law, who had a grim look on her face, presented a document to me as soon as I greeted her, and she said in a hateful tone, "You quit your job as soon as you got married, and became a full-time housewife, but you didn't do any housework and lived off Andy's earnings." When he pointed it out, he was told to pay $100 as a fine, and he lamented that even his little allowance was taken away from him. When Andy couldn't bear it anymore, and scolded you sternly, you ran away to your parents' house, didn't you? Since his mother lives in a rural area, he took advantage of the fact that they hardly interact with each other, and apparently he told his mother as if I was such a bad person. She wouldn't listen to me, even if I tell her the truth, because she is blindly believing all his lies. While I was thinking like this, my mother-in-law stared at me and quietly asked me, "I don't want to interfere in the affairs of an independent couple, but this is just too much. What do you plan to do from here?" I had mentally prepared myself to some extent, since I returned to my parents' house, so I responded calmly, "If he wants a divorce, I'll accept it." Upon hearing my response, my mother-in-law seemed taken aback, but after letting out a long sigh, she immediately stood up, placed the money for her drink on the table, and quietly left the cafe. Afterward, I filled in the divorce papers that she handed me, and submitted it to the city hall on the same day. After I finished explaining, Andy, who looked pale, hastily said, "Wait a minute. The divorce papers weren't meant to be submitted. Your husband, never intended to divorce you, so that piece of paper is invalid, right?" He then continued to babble, in a confused manner, "If we get divorced, won't you be in trouble? No one will want an old hag like you anymore. But I'll marry you again, so you can rest easy. You are lucky." As usual, Andy, with a condescending tone, spouted incomprehensible things. I stared at him with a cold expression, and couldn't help but sigh. "What are you even talking about? The divorce has already been finalized long ago, so there's no way to change anything now. Moreover, I'm currently engaged." Perhaps Andy never expected it, so his eyes widened and he froze. "Do you understand what I'm saying? I have a fiancé, and we're getting married next month." When I said it so that I can make it clear to him, Andy looked panicked and ranted. "Why are you suddenly saying this? It's so obvious that you're lying. Just so you know, just because you don't want to go back home, you can't make up random stuff and try to trick me. Don't underestimate me." I was only speaking the truth, but Andy didn't seem to understand. As I pondered what to do with him, the front door unexpectedly opened, and a man walked in, saying, "I'm home." The man looked at me and Andy alternately, and he looked puzzled. Andy, shocked by the sudden appearance of an unfamiliar man, froze in place. When I looked at the man, he tilted his head curiously and asked, "What's going on here?" I smiled wryly, and said to Andy, "This is my fiancé, Fabian." He greeted Andy with a questioning expression. Andy, sweating profusely on his forehead, was gradually retreating. It was understandable. Fabian has been practicing martial arts since he was in school, and he was an imposing man at first glance. Andy, whose attitude had changed drastically from earlier, put on a forced grin and began making excuses. "Just wait a moment. Back when I attended a company dinner, my senior colleague egged me on, saying, 'As married life goes on, women will start getting cocky, so it's better to make them understand their place early.' I didn't really want to do those things, but since my colleague was insisting. You get it, right?" As if he were saying he wasn't at fault, Andy offered up this ridiculous excuse. In response, I turned a surprisingly cold stare at him. Perhaps because he didn't receive the reaction he expected, Andy started sweating and looked troubled. Addressing Andy, Fabian spoke in a low voice. Could you please leave right now? And please, never bother Haley again. If you continue to harass her in the future, I'll take the appropriate measures." It seemed that Andy was overwhelmed by his forcefulness, and he left in a hurry. For a while after that, I was cautious, fearing that Andy might show up again, but a month had passed without a trace of him. Fabian and I registered our marriage without any issues, and began living together near our workplace. One day, I bumped into my friend, who introduced Andy to me in town. At first, I was having casual small talk with her who I hadn't seen in a while, but she seemed to have remembered something and began talking about what happened to Andy. Come to think of it, several days after he came to my parents' house, Andy had resigned from his job. Apparently, that senior colleague was persistently sexually harassing a young female employee, and Andy had joined in the harassment. This created a major issue within the company. In the end, the senior colleague was transferred to a remote place due to the harassment, and Andy, who had been his lackey, was going to face a similar fate. However, unable to bear it, Andy had handed in his resignation. According to my friend, Andy had registered with a temp agency and was taking on day labor jobs to make ends meet. However, his pride got him into trouble everywhere he went, and finally, the temp agency stopped offering him a job. Furthermore, it seemed that his mother found out that he had quit his full-time job, and the reasons behind it. "A scoundrel like that is not my son," she said, and disowned him. Currently, Andy is drowning his sorrows in alcohol, while he is looking for a job. On the other hand, I've been living peacefully with my husband, to whom I just got married. My husband is the younger brother of my childhood friend, and apparently he had harbored feelings for me for a long time. We had started dating shortly after my divorce, and while I had some concerns, his kindness and sincerity had steadily drawn me in. Previously, I had shouldered all the household chores alone, but my husband willingly shares the workload, without complaint. He would offer words of encouragement and gratitude for even the smallest things with a smile. Our married life is filled with a peaceful atmosphere and a sense of happiness. I am sure that I can live happily ever after with my husband. Next to my husband, who smiled kindly at me, I felt a clear and promising future ahead of us.